If you would like to increase your media literacy, let's talk about 3 different interpretations of Jane Eyre. I can't be bothered to find the filter, but you'll just have to take my word for it. One interpretation will be the one that I feel the text upholds. One will be an interpretation that I don't think is upheld by the text, but I don't disagree with. And last one will be one I feel is not upheld by the text, and I will throw hands with anyone who has that point of view. Interpretation number 1, Jane Eyre is a romance. The core of this book is romantic, right? Jane starts out single in the beginning, falls in love with a man, and ends up married by the end of it. That relationship is transformative to her life and has a big impact on it, as we see with many romance novels. And perhaps the key feature of a romance novel is that it ends in a happily ever after, and Jane Eyre does indeed end with Jane and Mr. Rochester being together. I guess it's technically too late for a spoiler warning now, but I do trust that you've read Jane Eyre if you've gone this far. I personally do not think that is the most likely interpretation of this book. If it is a romance novel, it's not a well-written one. Mr. Rochester's parts are only a small piece of this. The rest details Jane's life through childhood, through schooling, and life after Mr. Rochester. Now, I'm not a heavy reader of contemporary romance, but I believe another key feature is that romance is either the only or the primary mechanism for transforming characters over the course of a story, and that is also not true of Jane Eyre. Because this is a biography of her life, it covers several transformations as she grows up. She's transformed by other things like her friend Helen's death, her discovery of her cousins, her ultimate inheritance of all the money that she receives, and these are all really treated with the same gravitas that the romance is given. My big sticking point for viewing this as a romance is that if the point is to introduce and support the relationship between Jane and Mr. Rochester, is Mr. Rochester intended to be an aspirational love interest? There are things about this book that are inarguably feminist. Jane is first of all a career woman before she ever has a cent to her name. She regularly acts in defiance of the men around her in her life, and ultimately she ends up with the power in the money that she inherits. So it seems contrary to the messages and characterization of this book that a man who would keep his wife locked in the attic is an aspirational love interest. I've seen that discussion go round and round online and in person, and I think as long as you're viewing Jane Eyre as a romance novel, it is a discussion that needs to be had. But I personally think there are other interpretations, one in particular that is more likely. It doesn't introduce the problem of Mr. Rochester being an aspirational love interest. But here's the thing. If you like to read Jane Eyre for the romance, if Mr. Rochester makes you kick your feet under the covers, I'm not going to fight you on that. There are a lot of romantic elements within it. There's a lot of beautiful language, sweeping scenery. It can be enjoyed as a romance book. You are 100% free to read this and view it as a romance. But I would think twice before recommending it to your friend who's been loving Bridgerton. Part 2, different interpretations of Jane Eyre. And yes, this is the one that I will throw hands with anyone who has this point of view. Jane Eyre is a cautionary morality tale. We start with Jane being a very ill-behaved child. She goes to school and she meets Helen. Helen is a perfectly behaved little child, and in the face of adversity, she must maintain her goodness, and ultimately God calls her home. This inspires Jane to, later on in life, make the moral decision of running away from Mr. Rochester. Since he was still married, it would have been morally wrong to marry him, or to ask him to divorce his wife, or have something worse happen to his wife. So Jane makes a difficult decision to run away because she remembers how Helen was rewarded being a child. Now, if you're asking who the hell has read it that way, that's the interpretation that I was taught in high school. First time reading it as an adult, I realized that's not the view that I take of this book at all. I also find it highly unlikely that that was Charlotte Bronte's intent in writing this book, specifically because at the end, the moral thing to do would have been to marry her cousin, St. John, and go overseas to be a missionary, and that is not what Jane chooses to do. But my biggest beef with that point of view is that it requires you to view a child dying of abuse and neglect as a good thing. So, unlike the first point of view where I can walk away and say, hey, you do you, if you legitimately think that Jane Eyre is a morality tale, I will come into your house at night and personally lick each piece of fruit on your counter. I will sick my cat on you, and she will bite your fingers. I hope the ghost of Charlotte Bronte watches you while you try to use the bathroom. Third and final interpretation, Jane Eyre is the story of woman's realization of and struggle with the patriarchy, until she manages to find a way to make it work for herself and build her own life. Viewing it this way, the story is dominated by the 4 men in her life: her cousin John, Mr. Brocklehurst, Mr. Rochester, and then her cousin St. John. Her life is a progression of response to these 4 men and the control that they exert. Chronologically, they build on each other, and Jane has to learn all over again how to respond to their particular form of control. First, her cousin John Reed is her childhood bully. He torments her physically and with chaos. She watches him interact with his sisters and particularly his mother. His mother's life is dominated by this terror of a child. And then ultimately Mrs. Reed ended up disgraced and abandoned by this man that she built her life around. Joan's chaos is direct contrast to Mr. Brocklehurst, who is also a tormentor and a bully, but with structure, order, and religious legitimacy. The cautionary woman at school is Helen. She refuses to respond, fight back, even internally, and it ultimately costs her her life. The next prominent man in Jane's life is Mr. Rochester. His contrast with Mr. Brocklehurst is he finally shows her that romance, that tenderness that she's been missing, and she's ready to go for it. She responds with the passion in return, and thinks that finally she's broken free of the control of men in her life by finding one that actually cares about her. Until she sees the woman who is the result of Mr. Rochester's treatment, his wife. Jane realizes that the mechanism of marriage provides no more freedom or love than her previous arrangements had. So she runs away and meets the fourth and final important man in her life, her cousin St. John. St. John's contrast to Mr. Rochester comes from the fact that he is very moral and upright. He would never do anything like ask her to commit bigamy. The woman at the receiving end of this form of control is Rosamond, St. John's love interest. And he tortures her in a way as well, by refusing to allow either of them the joy of being together. Instead, he pursues Jane, who he believes is more suitable to missionary work. And after surviving all of these men and watching the results of their control on the women around them, Jane stands up for herself and says no. And she is rewarded for all of that by finally achieving control over her own life, the inheritance of a fortune. Charlotte Bronte really understands that money is power. Money is a way that men have controlled women for generations. And the happiest ending she can think of to give Jane is to give her a fortune so she's well off. But we also do have a touch of romance in there as well, and we do want it to end with a happily ever after. Jane returns home and finds Mr. Rochester has been blinded by an accident which also killed his wife. Now, not only does Mr. Rochester display differences in character, showing that he has changed from the man who kept his wife locked in the attic, there's also a shift in the power dynamics. Jane is now the provider for them. She can take care of them forever with all the money she inherited. And as a blind man, he will be reliant on her. That shift in power dynamics and the arc that Mr. Rochester's character made gives them their happily ever after. Because approaching it this way accounts for the majority of actual story told in the book, I think that this is the most likely interpretation, but I'm certainly willing to hear your take, unless you're a fan of the second interpretation, in which case, please get away from me. If you enjoyed this and would like to see me break down other works of literature, please let me know in the comments.